Hey y'all! Well, we're here for the final video on our Boyuurange A50 modification video series. And I know a lot of y'all have had questions about which sounds better, my DIY or this modified Boyuurange. And no spoilers, we're going to save that for the end. But there are a few bonuses to each of these, and I'll try to cover those in as objective a manner as possible. I know that doing a totally from scratch DIY build is daunting for a lot of people, and because you are having to do all the metalwork, the layout, the measuring, it's just, if you've never done that kind of work, I'm sure it is intimidating. Plus, there's tools you need to buy, like some of these green leaf punches, or for this build, I think there's a couple of them you need to buy. There's drill bits, and I don't think you really need a drill press. I don't use one, but you're still going to need a nice drill instead of drill bits. You're going to need some files. You're going to need a lot of stuff that possibly you don't own, which would add to the cost. The other thing, I guess, is the aesthetics. I mean, I personally think this looks a lot nicer, and the blue matching my nails is a bonus. This one does come with a cage, which if you have little kids and this is going to be within their reach, that might be something that's important to you. I do think it looks better like this without the cage, and so if I own the amp, I would be running it without the cage anyway. The bonus to the DIY, you get to pick what tubes you're going to put in it. It comes with tubes that you're paying for. And in my opinion, these PS Vane 300B tubes are just okay. They're not what I would call stellar. One of the things that I've noticed with both sets of these tubes, but more so with these, is when I was doing harmonic distortion pulls with these PS Vane tubes, they do have more distortion, and there's a pretty big difference in distortion levels between the two tubes, as much as 2% difference at the higher output levels. If you buy this amp, here's $225 that you're going to have to invest on top of what this amp costs. And while you could sell these really as new on eBay, especially if you never use them, and you might get 100 to 150 bucks for them, you still got to go through all that hassle of, buying these tubes and then selling these tubes. Same thing with the rectifier. The rectifier tube that comes in this thing is not what we need to be using. So you're going to have to go buy a 5AR4. You're paying for this Chinese rectifier tube, this big thing here, and you're not going to use it. And it's of questionable quality anyway. Same thing with the driver tubes. The ones that come in this amp are junk. I mean, even if you do nothing else with your A50, you need to get rid of these tubes. Luckily, these 6H8C Russian tubes sound really decent in this amp. I mean, I'm not going to say they're as good as a new old stock, the bad boy Sylvanias or any of the tall bottle Sylvanias, but they sound really good. And so, whether it's worth investing in, I'm using the Sylvanias in my DIY amp, and I think they're going for 50 bucks a piece, where you can get these for about 10 each. Some people, there's specific models of these, people are trying to sell for over $100. I'm not sure it's worth that, but so, bonus for the DIY, downside to the Boyuurange is with this amp, you're paying for tubes that you're not going to end up using. You're basically going to be replacing all the tubes. Okay, downside number 2. The DIY amp has 5-volt regulated heaters on the 300B that also have balance pots on them so that you can adjust these for the lowest noise. Now, one thing that's kind of weird that I've noticed, you would think with DC that these things wouldn't be needed. you can definitely hear more and less hum with the volume all the way off, trimming these little bias pots, or not bias pots, but they're the heater voltage balance pots. This amp, no way to do that, doesn't have regulated 5 volts, and so if you end up with voltage that's 130 volts or 120 volts, the voltage on the heaters is going to vary with the voltage at the amplifier. So another win for the DIY amp. Overall, this amp's quieter at idle. This amp, even before and after modifying, doing the virtual center tap on the heater for the 6S and 7 with two 100 ohm resistors and putting the DC offset on that helped a little bit, but I think the majority of the noise is still coming from the heaters of the 300B, and there's no way to do the fine-tuning balance of the voltage across the heaters, which you do have with the DIY amp. Okay, on a bonus for the A50, it's got light up VU meters. Guys, how many people actually care about that? I mean, what kind of information is that really telling you other than, hey, I've turned this amp up so loud that it's distorting? I think you'll be able to hear that. And at most reasonable listening levels, these meters are barely moving, and then people are wanting to do modifications to them so they dance around on the front of the amp. To me, that's not a win. I would much rather have what this amp has is a milliamp meter that's switchable so we can read the cathode bias of these tubes and make sure we don't have a problem. That's much more valuable information, and it also tells you pretty much how strong the tube is. And if it starts, it's 80 milliamps when the tube's new. When it gets down to 60 or 50 milliamps, the tube's worn out and it's time to go buy new tubes. With this amp, you have no idea. So, another win for the DIY amp. If we look at the distortion versus power, very similar, which I'm not real surprised that I think this one wins a little bit, but it's really close because they've basically got the same circuit, the same voltage, all that running through the driver's circuit, which is where the problems exist, at least in stock form with this amplifier, and the way this amp had problems when it had the initial Sun Audio J.C. Morrison style direct coupled 6S and 7 driver setup, as opposed to the Cascode that we put into both of these amps. The other thing, DIY amp, we know the quality of the parts that we put in it. I bought these parts through Mauser. I know that the Nikon caps in this amp are the actual made in Japan Nikon caps. I know that the chokes are Hammond chokes. I know these Edcore transformers. I know what quality those are. I know the quality of this choke. I know the ratings on all these parts. And I know that everything's within spec and that it's high quality stuff. In this amp, there's still a lot of parts I know nothing about. I don't know what this power transformer is actually capable of pulling as far as a milliamp rating. I don't know what the choke's milliamp rating are, or even what the voltage rating is. I clearly found that the coupling cap in here was a fake ERO cap, which to me makes the rest of the components inside this amp suspect. So then you're replacing a bunch of the capacitors that are inside the amp. So again, you're paying for parts that you're throwing in the trash can. With a DIY, you can pick whatever coupling caps you want. You can pick if you want to use Audio Note, or if you want to use Nikon, or if you want to put some cheaper caps in. You can at least make that choice where they've made that choice for you and made what are most likely knockoffs of whatever was written on the side of the capacitor. I don't trust what's in here. So another win for the DIY. I have no idea what's inside these boxes that they've potted as output transformers. I've lifted them up and looked. They're filled up with potting stuff. There could be a transformer this big inside there. With this one, I know how big the output transformers are. And I know what all the specs are on this one. With this one, I did have to do the turns ratio measurement, which I show in another video. Another plus to me for the DIY amp is it has 5K impedance output transformers, and this has 3.2K. In my opinion, a 3.2K is a little low for the impedance on a 300B tube, especially if you're looking for low distortion. And what was kind of surprising to me when you look at the THD versus power levels, these 5K ones are right there with the 3.2 and actually have a better distortion profile across the range. Okay, now we're going to get to the part everyone's been waiting for, the subjective listening part. I have to preface this with a lot depends on what speakers you're going to be driving with these amplifiers. I'm using some Klipsch RP600Ms. I don't have $20,000 speakers. Maybe you do. I don't know. In my opinion, if you've got $20,000 speakers, why are you buying a $1,000 amplifier and worried about the cost? So we're targeting this more to people on the mid-range kind of components that probably have, $500 to $1,000 speakers. And look up online and see what their impedance curve looks like. I know with my RP600Ms that especially at the lower frequencies, the resistance drops down to close to 4 ohms. And so that's one of the reasons that I spec a 5K output transformer, is that I know that the impedance is going to drop down low on the low end, and I wanted to keep it within the impedance that the output tube can run, because remember that the impedance that the tube sees is reflected by the load that's on the speaker jacks. Having said that, when I listen to this amp, it sounds better with the speakers hooked up to the 4 ohm jacks, because we have two options here. One was a 20-to-1 turn ratio, and the other was a 29-to-1 turns ratio. And one of them with an 8 ohm load is 3.2K. The other ratio, it ends up being about 6K. While 6K is a little high, I think the low 3.2 was really too much for reflecting that load to the output tubes, and I was hearing some distortion. And it just didn't sound as rich when it was hooked up to the 8 ohm taps. So if you have one of these, make sure you play with hooking your speakers up to both the 4 ohm and the 8 ohm, and listening to the amp and seeing which one sounds better to you. So that said, when we went to the 4 ohm taps on this, I feel like we lost a little power. And I was having to run the volume control at probably 5/8 to equal the same sound pressure level in the room that I was getting off half volume on this amp. This one has a 25-to-1 turns ratio, which is like halfway between the two options of this. So again, I feel like, at least for my speakers, another win for the DIY, in that the output transformers you're able to optimize it to the speaker load that you're going to be putting on the amplifier in your situation, where this one, you've got to use what's here. And so both of these amps were burned in for about 6 hours with a dummy load on them, with a 1K hertz signal going through them, to do whatever burning in's going to happen. Because I see some people say, oh, well, you didn't burn in the amp. That's why it sounds like it did. Didn't happen here. These amps both got burned in. After listening to these for 2 to 3 hours each with various kinds of music, and did some really, as quickly as possible, back-to-back swaps with, I would play 30 seconds of a track, turn that amp off, put this one in, turn it on, play that same track, then find another track that I felt like really had some bass that was hard to pull out of the track, but that also had some, potentially shrill high end that could be fatiguing to listen to if the amp tended in that direction. After what I consider is a pretty extensive listening test, the DIY amp wins that as well. What I heard was just better bass response was the main thing that I heard out of this amp. It had a smoother bass, it was more powerful, and even though these are some little bookshelf speakers, you could feel the bass in the room with this amplifier where you really couldn't with this one. And I think the problem would just get worse if you had a wider range speaker than what I'm using. These Klipsch's, I think, only go down to 40 hertz. If you're running speakers that go down to 20, you're going to hear even a bigger difference. And the only thing that I can attribute it to is these output transformers. Clearly, these would not fit inside this little box. So we got more iron here. And the old saying that if you want some bass, put some big iron in your amp, I think applies here. Well, why don't you just replace the output transformers? Now we're starting to get to the point of what's left. If we're replacing all the tubes, we're replacing most of the capacitors inside the amp. Now we're replacing these expensive output transformers. What's the purpose of spending $1,000 on this amplifier trying to get it to sound like this does when this amp built like you're seeing sitting here is at the same price point as this, of course, minus your labor. So if you buy this amp, then put your labor into it, then you buy these upgrade parts, then you buy these tubes, you're probably going to be at, I haven't sat down and figured it out exactly, you're probably going to be at $1,300, $1,400 just in the amplifier plus parts, and then your labor. If you replace the output transformers, that's another, these Ed cores were $200 for a pair of them. Now you're talking about your $1,500, $1,600 into this amp. Trying to make it sound like this one did, that's the same price that this one costs from Amazon. The other problem you run into this amp with this chassis that it's made of is this is basically what I call undrillium. And you might say, what's undrillium? It's metal that you can't drill through. It's just going to burn up every drill bit you put against it. Once you get this stainless steel and then chrome plate it, good luck trying to drill holes through it. Now, I do have to consider that some people are intimidated by fabricating something up from scratch, and maybe they would be able to do the modifications that I show in this video series. Know that you're probably going to have, $1,300 in it out the door. Maybe if you sell these tubes, you can recoup a little of the money and be happy with what you get from this. If you know that you're not going to be happy with what this sounds like with these output transformers, then I would go another route. I guess to wrap this up, I'm going to say, if you really want good sonic quality, give this DIY build in my budget series that I posted a shot. Even if you have to go take the chassis to a fab shop to get them to punch all the holes and stuff in it for you, or at least the tube socket holes and some of the harder to do stuff, that this is just a much better value. if you do decide you want to go this route, I would limit your modifications to what I've shown in this video of 5AR4, bump up the B+, wire up the cascode, and if you really want to just kind of go the next step, do the extras that I showed of moving the resistors and call it a day. If you need more bass response than this puts out, rather than spending the money on getting some bigger output transformers that are higher quality, I would just buy a powered sub and put it in the room, hook your signal to it, and just turn it down to a low enough volume where it's filling up the bottom end that this amp's not capable of doing. I think that's a much more reasonable solution than replacing the output transformers trying to get there. So I hope that this clears up some of your questions. I guess a final thing, I've had several people sending me emails and instant messages and stuff saying, hey, I want to send my A50 to you to modify. I'm not doing that service. I really just don't want to get into that. I'm enjoying making these videos. This is a hobby for me. And at this point, I don't think that doing this kind of labor-intensive work repetitively is something that I'm really interested in doing. Someone else asked me, are you going to be doing like a detailed instruction manual that, that people can print out and use, like with text and pictures and stuff on doing these modifications? No, I'm not planning on doing that. Potentially, if there was enough interest, I could see putting together like a parts kit for doing this modification, where you place an order, and then for $100 or whatever the parts come up to, I put together a kit with all the resistors and all the capacitors and LEDs and everything you need to do this modification. And if I do decide to go that route, I likely would print up something to install the kit as far as directions, but we're not there yet. So I hope that answers all your questions about this build, about this project, about the difference between the two. And for folks that already own this amp, yeah, go ahead and do the modification. If you don't own it, I'm not sure I would buy this with the idea of modifying it, thinking you're going to get some $2,000 Dennis Had comparable amplifier, because you're just not. Again, like most things in life, you get what you pay for. And an amp pre-built this quality, you're going to spend $1,500 to $2,000. So for the final words, I don't want people to think that this modification wasn't worth doing, because the difference really is huge from the as-delivered amplifier to the one with the Skunky Designs mods done to it. If you look at the original THD versus distortion as the amplifier came from Amazon versus the THD versus distortion after we did the modifications by jacking up the B+ and changing to a cascode front end, the differences are huge. Not only are we making well over twice the power at 3% distortion that the amp was delivered to me as, if you look at the distortion levels at the original 3%, 3 watts that it was delivered as versus what it can now put out at 3 watts, it's only 0.5% distortion. And also, don't get me wrong, the bass response of this amp now and the frequency response curve is hugely improved. It just doesn't have the bass that this DIY 300B amp does with these EdCore output transformers. I do want to thank the viewer that had this A50 drop shipped to me and trusted me to do these mods on it and was able to make this video series. And I hope that you guys find this very informational, even if you don't own an A50 and have learned something through the process of modifying this amplifier. If you're enjoying my videos, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I'll see you soon for some more tube amplifier fun. Have a great day.